They call it sovereignty, the right to self-govern, the power to determine your own laws, your own economy, your own future. But tribal nations in the United States exist in a strange limbo, recognized as sovereign, yet bound by federal law, limited by the Supreme Court rulings, and dependent on a government that has spent centuries breaking its promises. And yet, right now, something has shifted. America is in turmoil, political chaos, economic instability, a battle over resources, laws, and power. And in the middle of it all sits sovereign nations. Not across the ocean, not in some distant land, but inside the wealthiest, most powerful country in the world. And the real question isn't what's been taken away, it's what's still possible. Because sovereignty is a gold mine, and it's just waiting for someone to pick up the tools and start digging. If you have to ask permission to exercise your rights, are you really sovereign? Tribal nations exist on paper as independent entities, but the reality, their legal status, their economic potential, and even their land use is defined by the very country they're supposed to be independent from. When the federal government wants to step in, it does. When the courts want to reinterpret treaties, they do. When states want to squeeze tribal lands for tax revenue, they try. And yet, despite all this, the greatest loophole in America still exists. Because while sovereignty has been weakened, it has never been destroyed. The question is, what if tribal nations actually used it? For decades, tribal casinos have been the poster child of economic success. They bring in billions, they create jobs. But here's the thing. In the grand scheme of sovereignty, casinos are small potatoes. A nation doesn't become powerful because it owns a few slot machines. It becomes powerful when it controls industry, when it produces what others need, when it turns sovereignty into economic leverage. And right now, tribes sit inside the most valuable economy on earth. They have something no one else has, a legal system that is separate from state and federal law. So why isn't this being used to its full potential? Sovereignty isn't just about laws. It's about the ability to operate outside the restrictions that bind the rest of the country. And that means opportunity. Right now, the US government regulates industries to the point of stagnation. Medical procedures are outlawed. Scientific research is buried in bureaucracy. Businesses are crushed under taxation and regulation. But tribal nations don't have to play by the same rules. They could be a pharmaceutical powerhouse where life-saving drugs are developed faster, cheaper, and without years of red tape that drive up costs and kill innovation. They could be a manufacturing center that beats China at its own game, low-cost production, but with a made-in-America label and indigenous jobs. It could also be a financial capital where businesses go to escape crushing taxes and invest in a system that actually benefits them. It could also be a tax-free trade zone that can bypass tariffs and economic policies set by Washington. If the US slaps a trade war on China, Mexico, or the EU, it doesn't matter. Tribes can act as a loophole to keep goods moving. Businesses looking for an escape from economic restrictions would have one, and it would be on sovereign land. A nation that produces wealth rather than just taking a cut from people throwing dice on a felt table. This is what sovereignty can mean. And yet, that's still just the beginning. America has a problem. It's divided, it's volatile, it's fighting over laws, identity, and who gets to be here. And in the middle of it all, tribal land sits as the last true sanctuary. Because here's the thing, the US calls indigenous migrants illegal. But how can we be illegal on our own land? From the tip of Patagonia to the Arctic Circle, indigenous blood outnumbers European ancestry in the Americas by 3-1. The only reason that hasn't been translated into power is because we've been divided. By borders we didn't create, by governments that never wanted us to rise, by economic systems designed to keep us powerless. The U.S. has spent centuries crushing indigenous autonomy all over the Americas. It's overthrown democracies, backed dictators, and forced millions into poverty, leaving our indigenous brothers and sisters with no choice but to leave their homes. And now, after breaking their nations, the U.S. dares to call them criminals for trying to survive? What happens if tribal nations open the doors? A population surge, millions of new tribal citizens ready to build an independent future, a workforce, skilled labor, engineers, scientists, entrepreneurs, and business leaders who have nowhere else to turn, a defense force, the strength to protect our sovereignty instead of relying on U.S. permission, a unified indigenous economy, one that spans from Canada to South America, breaking free from U.S. control. If sovereign tribal nations welcome indigenous migrants as citizens, the entire balance of power in America shifts. Because when we are divided, we are powerless. But together we become something else entirely, a real nation. And real nations don't need permission. Singapore is smaller than many tribal nations. Monaco is the size of a small town. The Vatican is just a collection of buildings. But all of them have one thing in common. They're recognized. Because sovereignty isn't just about what you call yourself, it's about who acknowledges you. And that means stepping beyond the U.S. framework. Right now, tribes don't have an independent military. They don't have defense allies. They don't have international recognition. But what happens if that changes? What happens when tribal nations build its own security force? What happens when it forms economic alliances with other countries? What happens when it starts negotiating deals outside of U.S. control? Because if sovereignty is real, then power is a choice. And for the first time in history, the conditions are right for a tribal nation to stop asking for permission and start acting like a nation. For centuries, tribal nations have been defined by what was taken from them: land, resources, autonomy, but sovereignty still exists. The only question is, will it be used? What happens when a tribal nation finally says, enough with the handouts, enough with playing small, let's build something bigger than the U.S. ever expected? What happens when tribes stop waiting for the government to recognize their power and start taking it? Because sovereignty is a gold mine, and right now it's just waiting to be claimed. Who's going to be the first to dig in?